All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nikki Neal. I'm the head of AWS GovCloud, Business Development and Go-to-Market. Really excited to be here and see you guys today. I think this is my 7th reInvent, my 6th on the AWS GovCloud team. And I can tell you that this never gets old. It's always super exciting to be able to come out and share with you guys some of the transformative things that our customers have been able to do with the cloud and GovCloud in particular. And today is really special because I'm going to be joined by Mason McDaniel, who's the Chief Technology Officer of U.S. Department of Justice Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives, or DOJ ATF. And ATF was one of the first customers that I worked with 6 years ago, a little bit over 6 years ago when I started on the GovCloud team. And at the time, they had this really audacious goal, which was to go all in on cloud. Certainly one of our first federal customers to say that they wanted to go all in on cloud. And they really had a phased approach, first looking at how they could address a disaster recovery requirement on the cloud, over time building out a primary production environment on cloud, migrating over their applications, and eventually retiring their on-prem data centers. And so it's been a really successful partnership with ATF over the years, and one that I would like to characterize as an unexpected journey. I think it might resonate with many of you who've undertaken very large transformation projects, and that you start out with these large goals, and along the way you're faced with these huge decisions that have to be made. And at any given point, these decisions are pretty consequential and can completely change the path that you take in terms of your transformation project. So in the case of ATF, and this is some of what you will hear from Mason, things like how are we going to address our technical debt? Once we actually go through and do our application discovery and rationalization, what are we going to do with those applications that aren't readily cloud portable? How are we going to address governance in the cloud? These are all things that from a technical perspective, from a policy perspective, require specific decisions that can be made that can vastly alter exactly the path that you take. I will say that in the case of ATF, I think that they have been particularly successful at this because they took a philosophy, and many of you may have heard something similar echoed from our Amazon executives, in that they were very stubborn on the mission, but very flexible on the details. And this is something that has really boded well for them over time, particularly given their agile software development approach. And so over time, we've been working with them, and the journey of 1,000 miles starts with the first step, or a single step. And for us, that step was, okay, so let's work with you on determining what's going to be your cloud infrastructure of choice. Ultimately, ATF decided that they were going to standardize on AWS GovCloud. There were lots of different things that factored into that decision, but it primarily came down to about 3, I would say, foundational tenets in terms of their infrastructure requirements. First and foremost being the need to meet a very high bar for compliance and security. ATF has FISMA high data and workloads, so they require FedRAMP high infrastructure. They also had a U.S. citizens operations requirement, which we're able to meet with GovCloud. And we spent some time in the early days working with them to help them get comfortable in terms of being able to inherit the underlying controls from AWS GovCloud and utilizing that to accelerate their authorization timeline, or their ATO. Secondly was resiliency, and needing a resilient, stable architecture. ATF has a very important mission in terms of national safety. In the US, they are running mission-critical applications, high-value assets, and many of these applications certainly have very high requirements in terms of availability. And they wanted to make sure that they were utilizing cloud infrastructure that can deliver on performance. So that meant getting them very comfortable with the idea of AWS regional constructs and being able to architect for high availability within a single AWS region, and eventually utilizing 2 or multiple AWS regions for multi-region resiliency. And then finally, access to the most innovative services and partner solutions. In the case of GovCloud, we've now been generally available for over 11 years. We have over 120 services that are available to customers on our platform. We also have one of the most robust partner ecosystems with 3 times as many PaaS and SaaS solutions that are authorized, FedRAMP authorized on the AWS GovCloud platform than our next leading competitor in this space. So for ATF and for other customers, certainly they can feel comfortable that they're building out on an infrastructure that can certainly evolve with them as their requirements evolve over time. And so ATF was successful in meeting their disaster recovery requirement. They went production ready on their primary landing zone or operating environment in 2019. And so then came the fun part, the challenging part, what to do about the applications. And that brings us to the focus of our discussion today. In working with ATF, I think the approach that they took was something that we've seen from other customers in terms of, let's first start with the data and figure out how we can have some type of enterprise data management platform. Then we'll deal with overhauling the business logic, rebuilding the applications. But what was really different for ATF and what made them stand out was the sheer scale in which they were undertaking this project. They were looking at basically overhauling or modernizing the vast majority of their enterprise applications, which is major. And so from our perspective, looking at it as the GovCloud team from a product management and product readiness standpoint, there were certainly things that we needed to double click on just to make sure that we could support them from a service and feature functionality standpoint. And so that meant certainly looking into data management and governance, things that can support enterprise data management platforms, things that customers can use to automate governance and take out some of that undifferentiated heavy lifting, containers and serverless. From a compute standpoint, that being the construct that many customers are now turning to for their modern application development, business process engineering, so those application integration services, things as our customers take and break down monolithic applications into microservices, making sure that we have application integration services that can support this approach. And finally, continuous integration, continuous delivery, deployment, so that we can support automated software deployments as customers push out updates to their applications moving forward. And so looking towards the future and some of the things that we're working with ATF, certainly multi-region resiliency, building out their infrastructure to incorporate both of our GovCloud regions, doing some really interesting things around machine learning, blockchain technologies. But certainly, I don't want you to hear about these things from me. I want you to hear from Mason McDaniel to come out and tell you a little bit about it. So if you guys would please welcome Mason McDaniel to the stage, the CTO of ATF, who's going to share their application modernization journey.
Cool. Thank you, Nikki. I'd like to tell you a story about the situation ATF found ourselves in, the plans on how we intended to address the position we were in, and the surprises that we found along the way, and how we had to adapt to those, because they derailed us and could very easily have spelled the end of the effort. But I don't want to stand up here and say, look at us, look how cool we are. Yes, I want to share some of the things that I think we did well, that hopefully you might be able to learn from. But the important part here is I want to share the mistakes that we made along the way that could have ended our effort, and how we adapted, how we corrected course to overcome them and eventually make it through into the cloud infrastructure. So one comment before I go on. You're going to see a number of diagrams and graphs and things that are relatively small, too small to see all of the details on them, and they go by fairly quickly. Please do not stress about trying to work out the details, because many of those are in as screenshots or examples of how we interpreted the things that I'm talking about within the context of our project. And they're here for two main reasons. One is as a general visual backdrop for the talk here. But for those of you who would like to download the slides afterwards, they will also serve as a reference that you can look at later on to help kind of cue in the interpretation, again, of what we meant by some of the things that I'm talking about. So I don't think I need to sell anyone here on the question, why modernize? We're techno geeks. That's what we're about. Most people don't come to reInvent if they aren't about improving technology, but we aren't the ones that we have to convince. It's the executives, it's the operational leadership that are often non-technical, that control the purse strings, that control the priorities of the organizations, that you have to convince to invest significant funds in what is essentially invisible IT. Systems work fine today. They're able to log in, they're able to do their job. Why should they put money into changing things? And the answer boils down to technical debt. A term you've probably heard a bunch about. It has specific meaning in the software development industry, but has broader meaning here to refer to anything that needs to be done to keep a system running the way it should be running that is not done, that is deferred. And that technical debt can accumulate over time. And very much like financial debt, technical debt carries interest. The older it is, the longer it's been around. In general, the more time it takes, the more resources it takes, and the harder it is to work off. So I want to provide just a few examples of some of the technical debt that we found at ATF and how we kind of couched that to our executives. Now, the day I took this picture on my deck in 2016, we received 38 inches of snow at our data center, and we had to evacuate the building for 2 days because the structural engineers were concerned the roof could not support the weight of that much snow. If that roof had collapsed, all ATF systems would have gone offline. And to make matters worse, 3 years prior, during sequestration, as a cost-cutting necessary step, ATF shut down their disaster recovery site. So the failover copies of all of our systems that would have taken over the load if something happened to the primaries had been moved into the same building and the same room as our primary systems. So if that roof had collapsed, all ATF systems would have been offline, primary and failover, with no practical way to recover. The servers running our enterprise mission-critical systems are older than my kids, and a couple of those are in college. They are no longer supported by the manufacturer. The manufacturer no longer has replacement parts for them, and we've exhausted, for the most part, the various supply avenues for replacement parts. So we're down to cannibalizing our own systems as they fail to pull parts and keep the remaining systems that are working running. That is not sustainable. And there were situations where if the wrong part failed, entire mission areas of ATF could drop offline, again, with no notice. Similar on the software front. The programming languages that we used, the operating systems, the commercial software that we use were, by and large, so old that the vendors would not support them, didn't know how to upgrade them in many cases. And in some cases, like the languages, we had Java 1.4, Oracle Form 6i, really old stuff that we hired Java developers for. They had to go back and relearn the language because you can't go to forums online or go to Barnes & Noble and buy a book on Java 1.4 at this point. Again, back to that point of technical debt carrying interest. It cost us more to find people, it took us longer to work on these systems because they were so old. And it ultimately left us with no choice but to do complete refactoring replacement of our systems because there was no graceful upgrade path. Now, so what? If we go offline, what does it really matter? There are three major mission areas to ATF. One, criminal enforcement, investigating, prosecuting, trying to disrupt violent crime involving firearms, explosives, arson, some incredible forensic laboratories that support that work. The second major mission area is regulatory, involves regulation of the firearms and explosives industries, licensing, manufacturers, kind of reviewing the applications and approving, processing those. For the manufacturers and distributors of the various devices, inspecting them to make sure that they are operating within the constraints of the law and doing simple things like storing their explosives in appropriate and safe bunkers, things that we don't want them to mess up. And a huge part of it involves the more controlled devices, such as fully automatic machine guns, silencers, up to grenades, rocket launchers, things that you're not going to go down to a standard shop and find. The third major area really overlaps the other two, and that's called crime gun tracing. And that's when you're at a crime scene and you find a gun at the scene, you pull the serial number from it. The systems and people that trace the history of that gun and try to track who owned it are run by this team. And ATF's not allowed to maintain any kind of database of law-abiding citizens linking to firearms. There's no place we can go to just run a search and see who owns any particular weapon unless it happens to have been used in a prior crime. So it's a very manual, very labor-intensive process to trace the history back through manufacturer, through the wholesale and distributors, through the retail organizations to hopefully who was the trigger puller. None of those are things that we want to just disappear. So we knew going into this, we were facing some daunting challenges, because as Nikki mentioned, we wanted to go all into the cloud. And change is hard, no matter what it is. Even if it's going from really bad on-prem equipment to an incredibly capable cloud platform, there's still a steep learning curve, and change is hard. So we knew we were going to be facing that. At the same time, for reasons I won't get into here, we had decided to migrate our enterprise standard database from one vendor to another. And I'll let you try to figure out who those might be. And at the same time, we decided to migrate our standard operating system from one vendor to another. That one's a little easier. But by far the biggest challenge we were going to be facing was what we affectionately call the ATF hairball. That is a connection diagram showing the major mission systems and databases at ATF and the ties between them. And those are not nice, clean, abstracted API interfaces. Most of those are direct data connections from one application to the database of another application, directly reading and writing. There is no way to easily extract those and separate those out. And that is why we've had, frankly, a pretty poor history of modernizing our IT. So we decided this time to take a very different approach. And instead of pulling the system out to try to modernize in isolation, as Nikki had alluded to, we flipped that to approach it by tier. We knew that most of these systems were integrated at the data layer, so we migrated all of the data across all of our systems from one database platform to another, migrated that data into our new AWS infrastructure that we were in the process of designing and building, and got it accredited, full accreditation, to be able to hold our production data before we ever migrated the first app. So then we could work application by application through refactoring them, and all of the data that they depended upon, even from other applications, was already there, which dramatically eased the problems that we faced with all of those interconnections. And we were taking a two-step approach. You should not automate bad business practices. I don't know how many people have stood up and said that. I don't know how many times I've said that. And that's the right approach if you're approaching a system, a couple of systems. When you're approaching your entire application portfolio, you can't do business process reengineering on all of them at the same time. There's no way you're going to get across the finish line. So we took the approach of first, pay off the technical debt, rebuild our existing business capabilities on modern technologies, and at the same time, take that opportunity to refactor those and modularize them, wrap them in automation so that we will be set up when we go across that line to start the kinds of continuous improvement focusing on the business process improvements that we really want. But the first stage was pay off that technical debt and then get us to that starting line so we can actually make those changes once we're actually in the cloud. Now, I could do, I don't know how many briefings, presentations just on this topic alone. And I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole here today, except to say that it doesn't do you a damn bit of good if you can build a VM or a container in minutes, if it takes you weeks to get it through your approval process so you can use it. So at the same time you are updating your technologies, you have to rewrite your IT governance to enable you to actually use them, or you're going to wind up with the same inefficient stuff that you've got, no matter what the architecture is that they're built on. So if you want to be able to make quick, rapid, small deployments multiple times a day or once a day, while users are on the system without impacting them. If you want to be able to make use of automated testing, setting up an automated deployment pipeline, you have to update your processes to support and enable those, and we did. Now, how many of you have ever visited DC? And for those that have, if you've ever driven across the Arlington Memorial Bridge into DC, that was that bridge in 2014 before they shut it down for emergency repairs. It was working just fine as a bridge. People were driving back and forth across it every day, not having any idea how broken it was beneath the deck. And that was ATF systems. One of the fundamental mistakes that I made when we started down the strategy of rebuild like for like, we were going to be using essentially the source code to our legacy systems as the roadmap of what those did, and then rewrite and refactor that in a modern language, modern framework. That assumed that our legacy systems worked. And what we found was that was not a valid assumption. One of our applications, for example, we found after a long time discovering 80% of the source code didn't actually work. And we didn't know that until well into the process. And ATF employees are dedicated and, if anything, resourceful. They're going to find a way to get the job done. And they did. So where the applications were not able to do what they needed, some particularly enterprising employees started writing SQL scripts and clearly worked with some IT staff to get the ability to have them directly read and write back to the production databases to change data that the applications were not able to correctly process, and handed those scripts out across different analysts and employees, and those became part of the official business processes. So when users got to a particular step in the application, they would step out, they would run a script on their desktop that changed the production database. They would go back into the application and continue working. Some of these scripts were 10,000 lines long, and there were hundreds of them, and none of that was in any official source code repository. And for the situations where that wasn't enough, they also gave a number of power users high-end database administration tools with the ability to go directly into the raw production database tables and change the stuff that the scripts and the applications couldn't. This is no judgment against our employees, they're fantastic. That's terrifying for a whole bunch of reasons. But also from an IT modernization perspective, that was all additional scope. We didn't know about any of that stuff going in, and that was stuff that we had to take into account and address. I'd like to provide a little visual metaphor for how the challenge we gave our development team changed. Let's say each one of those dots is some module of software. And we hand you as developers that pattern and say, reproduce those dots exactly. Give us that with some cool new fancy paint. Okay, it's going to be labor intensive, but no biggie, you can do that. But now we find out, after a whole bunch of work, that's not what we want. We actually only want a pattern with 20% of those dots, but I can't tell you which 20%. Get busy. Turns out that's what we want. But that's all we could give the developers to work with. There's no way to succeed that way. That is an entirely fundamentally different challenge. So again, so what? We were using the source code as our roadmap. Effectively, we lost our requirements. So we had no reliable requirements that we could follow at that point once we discovered kind of the situations that we had with that source code. So, and this is the one that I would say is, for me personally, most embarrassing, because I've been an advocate of Agile development for years. I've run large-scale Agile programs for years. And I made another kind of fundamental mistake here that really goes back to just Agile 101 principles. Engage your stakeholders early and often. Because we had the source code and we're just reproducing existing functionality exactly, just in a different way, I let myself fall into the trap of thinking we didn't need to take the valuable time of our subject matter experts, and as long as it did what the original system did, then we were good. So we started out following the source code. When we discovered gradually that that was not usable, we still had a number of other artifacts that we tried to work through, but we were still having our development team do the testing. And we brought the results to the user base, the user community, once they thought they had developed it through essentially to a working product. I don't care what processes you follow, I don't care what you call it, that's waterfall. And it went about as well as most large IT waterfall projects went. We weren't even close. So we had to step back and really do some soul searching. And we talked with my boss. We agreed that I would set aside some of my typical CTO duties to really focus in on trying to help get it turned around. And more importantly, we went to the mission directorates, the leadership, and told them we needed some of their best subject matter experts detailed to our development team, essentially full-time, to work day in and day out with the developers as true product owners to help clarify what was needed. Oh yeah, don't do that. No, that's bad. But to clarify what was actually needed, what was meant by some of those requirements that were put in, help to document those, and more importantly, to do the testing so our end users are the ones that are going in and determining whether it actually does what they need or not. And through the course of that testing, then they see and get reminded of other things that they do within the software, really minor business rules that may not jump out of looking at screens and such, that we need to create new stories for, add into our backlog, and keep refining our requirements as we went. This was the number one thing that allowed us to ever get to any kind of a transition into a production. Without getting that kind of engagement, we would have kept the car running at 70 miles an hour the whole time, but we would have been going the wrong direction. Now, we have the subject matter experts on. We've got a team that is effective. The problem we had was that we had a backlog of thousands of user stories or requirements, and we didn't know which ones were right. We knew some of them were valid, but again, kind of back to that source code problem, we knew a lot of them weren't because of how off the mark we were with what we deployed or what we offered to them for testing. So we decided to take a step back, 30,000-foot view. Let's look at our processes as a whole. Where is all of the work that we have, all of the work in process within our overall processes, and how efficiently is it flowing through those processes? Where is it getting stuck? When we open a story to work on, are we closing it out in the same sprint? Or is it getting carried sprint after sprint after sprint for months? So how effectively is the work being worked, and why are the bottlenecks there that we found. And the number one reason we discovered was rework. Developers developing what they thought was needed, it getting bounced or sent to the subject matter experts for testing, said, nope, that's not it, bouncing it back and forth, trying to get it working. A lot of duplicate work, keeping those stories on, and keeping the velocity with which we could develop stuff lower than it should have been. So we knew we needed to work on the quality of what was in our backlog, because again, it doesn't matter how fast your car is going if you're going the wrong direction. So I made the decision to stop development, kind of across the board, at least stop focusing on the development, and put in place a process where every one of our user stories had to be verified by an ATF subject matter expert. They had to verify the subject was correctly written, the description of it was accurate, and that the acceptance criteria were specific enough so that if the developer built it to meet those acceptance criteria, there was a high likelihood it was going to pass the subject matter expert's test. So we counted how many were verified, we tracked it. As we started getting a core set of those that were verified and that we knew were accurate, then we would start peeling off some of the developers to go work on those while the rest of the team continued through the process verifying the rest of them. So now we have a backlog of work that is reliable, that we know is correct as far as it goes. But we also know that it is not complete. There is a lot of work that we have yet to capture as stories. But how can we start making some projections? And you'll probably hear a lot of people say, it's agile development, you can't do forecasting, you can't do projections. That is not true. You can, it's just very different. And for our projections, we just decided to start work with what we did know, and that was what was in the backlog. So we looked at everything there, we prioritized what absolutely had to be in on day one when we went live, what were features that the users wanted on day one, but they could potentially live without, and then what were some nice to haves. And then we analyzed our historical performance, looking across everything in the backlog, or everything in our Agile management system of all the historical data. For every individual team, because you don't want to compare some of these metrics across different teams, for every individual team, how did they estimate the complexity of the work? What was their velocity on how much that team was able to complete on a regular sprint on an ongoing basis? And start building some of these historical averages and trends that we could use to then project out on what was still in the backlog for the work that we did know about. The big challenge with any Agile project is how do you estimate the unknowns? And we decided to start out approaching that really with, again, one of the fundamental Agile concepts of epics. Very large, large-scale business processes that may have many, many stories underneath them, but are overall kind of big chunks of functionality that we know the system had to provide. And then we work with our subject matter experts to, one, pull out all of the user stories that were in our backlog and link which of those high-level functions that they went to. And then, and when you're starting out, this was by far the most hand-wavy part of it all. What is their gut feel on how much of that total functionality needed for those have we captured as stories in our backlog? Not completed, but how much have we just documented the need to build? And that would let us estimate based on how much we actually had in the backlog, how much we thought we had adequately captured, a rough estimate of how many missing stories are there that we have yet to pull out of the subject matter experts' heads and get into our backlog. Again, rough, but it was a starting point. And then, I don't care what you're doing in IT, unless it's trivially simple, there are gonna be surprises along the way. We certainly found that on our project, and we knew that we were gonna continue finding that. So we also put in a factor for the unknown unknowns, or just the true surprises. So between all of that, the known data, the stuff that we knew we hadn't captured yet, and the true unknowns and surprises, we had enough data to start making some really rough projections out. And again, unlike Waterfall, we were not going to be saying, here is a guaranteed date, here's a go-live date that we are going to hit with our system. We were very careful to couch it as this is our best estimated date. We laid out to our director, to our executive leadership, here is the process that we used to estimate this, here's how we did it, here are the error bars and all of the unknowns that go into this. But based on that context, here's when we think we are going to be in a position to go live. And also, kind of critically, explaining to them what we're going to do to lower those error bars over time. So it's one thing to go in and say, we can't give you all the answers and this is really a rough spread. You can't say that forever. So we were going to be going through and kind of working on continuing to pull those requirements and those user stories out of the heads of the folks that knew them and coming up with more refined estimates. So that was part of our initial presentation there. One painful lesson that we learned, human nature is to overestimate how much you know about something and underestimate how much you don't know about something. I still think there's a lot of value to this as just an initial step into estimating, but even still, we tried to be realistic. We were an order of magnitude off. Where we thought we were 80% through capturing stuff, yeah, it was more like 8%. It is incredible how many really small little business processes, little details wind up getting added in as stories and pulled in as things that you have to do. So we were still off on that a fair amount, but it was a reasonable starting point. But when you go into this kind of an effort, start out realistic, swing in the pessimistic direction, and then cut it again, because trust me. Now, with that data, we started actually running out the projections, and it was not pretty. Our trend line on when we were going to be burning our work down to any theoretical zero where we might be able to go live, it's a whole different discussion on how that zero doesn't exist, but we'll set that aside for now. We weren't even close. And we brought this data back to our executive leadership to say, we know they wanted us to go live around March of 2021. And we showed this, again, with the backing information of how we came up with it, said absolutely not possible. And then that started the discussions of what is possible, what is realistic, what may be a fair trade-off on what we could do. And we wound up setting some new targets. But to get there, I'd created this kind of analytical tool that tied into our Agile management system, pulled all of the data out of it, and crunched everything from prior history to update, at any given point in time, update those averages and trends, and use those to project out all of the known data on when we might be able to burn down, go live. And then put these dials up at the top, these sliders that we could adjust that had some target metrics on, so we could start playing out scenarios. If we were to cut back on how many required stories we had and essentially accept less, what does that do to our potential go live date? If we increase the velocity of the team, what does that do? So a number of these potential kind of management knobs we could dial, we could put in here and see what are the net effects of those, but also on the flip side, we could put in a target date and say, if we want to be able to go live in September, what do we have to do? What trade-offs are we going to have to make in order to make that feasible? And then sit down with that data with the executives to start talking in practical terms about those trade-offs. And those were really hard discussions and hard decisions. And what came out of that was, again, for a variety of reasons, we knew we could not go on indefinitely. Not the least of which was just the fear that the hardware was going to fail and take us offline. There were a lot of other things pushing the time frame. But all the way up to the director decided that they were going to make the call that our users needed to go back into our backlog and identify almost a third of what they had flagged as absolute mandatory must be there day one, and figure out a way to live without it, at least for some period of time until after go live it could be added. And then anything that was on the wanted or wish list, those were going to be added after go live. That is a really big ask of the user community. And we didn't want to make them be the only ones to sacrifice stuff. So we did everything we could on the IT side to increase how much we could get into the system whenever that go live date wound up being. So we wound up adding in and really focusing on automated regression testing, increasing from every 2 weeks doing a push to our test environment to every week to daily pushes into our test environment. So the subject matter experts could be in there every day testing and evaluating the functionality that had just been created by the developers and shortening that feedback loop. And we also bumped up the team size a little bit, trying to increase that velocity. Now, we had that analytical tool that we built, and we started using that every day to start building out projections that looked like this, where the gray bar was the current month. Everything to the left of that was actuals, showing where we actually were. And you can see that huge drop in the solid blue line where our users did go in, and they pulled out a huge amount of functionality that they were going to find ways to live without. And then at the current month, it split. The dark line was showing if we hit our metrics for that month, set by those sliders, that's what our trend line was going to look like. The thin blue line was if we didn't finish anything else for the rest of the month, that's where our trend line looks. It's the point in time as of that day. And we could watch every day as we added stories, things that we captured from our subject matter experts, as our team completed stories, until the next month. It snaps over, updates that month with actuals, and refreshes the projections based on the current state and time. So again, that let us kind of model out and get really almost real-time ideas about whether we were trending ahead or behind, if there were things that we needed to try to adjust from a management perspective, or if we need to just communicate up the chain, say that we don't see a way necessarily to fix it, but we'd better let the bosses know that things are starting to slide a little bit. So as we started getting closer to potential go-lives, we knew we were going to be going live without all of the functionality our users said they needed. But which functionality were we going to go live without? And how much of it? And more importantly, what is the actual user impact of that functionality? So to help work with the leadership to identify when a reasonable compromise date was and what work we actually focus on completing before then, we went into the backlog and wrote out text descriptions in just plain English. What is the practical effect on our users if that story is not complete by the time we go live? And what is the workaround? Like, are there any workarounds? If they can't do something through that process, but there's a really simple parallel process, they could do exactly the same thing with no effort, no biggie. But if it's a moderate impact event that blocks a fair amount of their work and there's nothing they can do about it, that could be a big deal. So for each of those, we established a numerical rating on where it fell within that spectrum. And then by plotting those numerical ratings, we're able to assign kind of an overall business impact rank to every story that was left in our backlog as something that was required for go live, and give us something to start focusing our efforts on so that we could make sure that we were working from the highest impact stories down to the lowest. So we could try to make sure that whenever we did go live, we were having the least effect possible on our users. And with our executive leadership, we could start having those hard trade-off discussions, drawing lines in the sand, and just say hypothetically, if we go live on this particular date, where are we going to be through those stories in the backlog? Are we still going to be in business impact rank 7, where we're going to be shutting down major parts of ATF? Are we going to be getting down to a point where what's left is lower impact, has more ready workarounds? And based on that, we narrowed in on a couple week kind of potential time frame for when we were going to be going live. Unfortunately, that wound up being right at the end of December 2021. And I don't think I need to tell you how bad of a time that is to try to do any major deployments. So that totally sucked, but it is what it is. Sometimes you got to do it. So again, don't worry about the details of everything on here. The main things I want to point out is along the left, we have each of the teams, each of the application teams laid out. Across the top, we had weeks along the schedule. And every one of those squares is one user story laid out based on the average velocities of those teams on how much work we expected they would be able to complete through that time. So we could see visually where was kind of the right kind of a trade-off line. And we settled in on the 1 week where we were going to be committing to going live. And December 17th, we started the data synchronizations and some of the initial deployment kind of back-end processes for our go live. December 23rd, we turned it on for our internal and external users. And it didn't work. It was so slow that everyone was seeing the spinning wheel of death. When it did respond, there were major functions not working. That's the point where every previous deployment we had ever done, we would have failed back, we would have licked our wounds, and 6 months later, we would have been talking about how do we try another deployment. We had committed with our leadership, and they were behind us, we were not going to fail back. This was going to be the test of those automation processes, all those cloud technologies that we had built it ourselves on. We were going to fail forward to something that did work. And on the very first day, shortly after we started seeing the performance issues that we were hitting, we doubled the capacity of our database tier in 30 minutes, and I was grumpy that it took that long. In the first day, we made 13 production deployments with efficiency improvements, with functional enhancements, and we saw the systems come up and start working and start responding. Within the first week, we had made 21 production deployments. And 3 weeks after our go live, we went to an industry conference, we sat down with some of the industry users and asked them for feedback, just how did it go? And all of the responses we got were some variation of these kinds of comments, where essentially it was, we spent several years and how many millions of dollars on that? But then they saw later that day, it was starting to actually work pretty well. And then it got faster and smoother, and they said it was obvious that the system was being improved and being worked on, and they said it was much better than the legacy environments. Now, we had focused our priorities on those external users to try to minimize the impact to them. We kind of threw some of our internal ATF employees under the bus in the process and made them accept less. So we were interested in how our internal users felt about it. And I don't want to paint an overly rosy picture. There's still a lot in our backlog that we need to get to them that they want done. We've added in a whole lot of enhancements, new capabilities, features that they've been wanting for a long time into the backlog. They see them there, they want them. There's a level of impatience that I absolutely understand and agree with. But that top one was a comment actually from just a month or so ago from users. It was leaps, bounds, Grand Canyon style progress over our legacy systems. So that was wonderful to hear because our users are demanding, and rightfully so. They are not going to be shy about sharing their opinions when things aren't going well. And believe me, they did. This is where theory meets reality. We talk continuous improvement. We talk about the ability to go live with something and then make frequent deployments afterwards. And we kept promising them that we would get some of these missing features up and running quickly after we went live. Every day on this is one bar. Or every bar on there represents 1 day in the 5 months after we went live, December 23rd. See, 90% of all of the work days since we've made production deployments, averaging 7 or more new features per day. They are seeing what that looks like to have new capabilities steadily coming online, various efficiency improvements added in that continue speeding up the systems. So that goes a long way toward buying the user buy-in and commitment for some of these new changes and capabilities. So, bottom line, quick key question. Was ITEM a success or a failure? By every waterfall measure, we were a failure. We were over budget, we were over schedule, we delivered without the minimum scope that our users said they needed. And I made that clear to our executive leadership, to our director. And to a person, they were adamant that they saw ITEM as an unmitigated success for 2 main reasons. One of my previous bosses said that decisions are only as good as the information on which they're based. And they knew at every point along the way that they had the most accurate, best information that they could to make the decisions, that we were fully transparent. So every time they had to make a decision about whether they added funding, agreed to an extended schedule, or whether to draw a line in the sand and say we're going live on this particular date, they knew that they were basing that on the most accurate data that they could get at that time. And that we communicated our challenges up front rapidly, and then we adapted and we overcame them, and they saw us correcting course and fixing the things that we saw as process and technological problems. I was at an event where I was talking with the former federal CIO, Maria wrote, and I'd made those same points about how ITEM was over budget, over schedule, and delivered without minimum functionality. And she really echoed our leadership's responses that, yeah, set all that aside. She saw ITEM as one of the largest IT modernization successes across the federal government. Again, because of its ability to hit a wall that should have stopped us and find ways around it to get across that finish line. Going back to the day job, what our users actually use the system for processing the licensing requests, approvals, for processing import requests for some of those controlled weapons. We did add in some new capabilities that took processes that had previously been very manual paper processes and bring them into the new versions of these applications. And that brought in a huge influx of users and new data that was getting submitted and transferred through. But if you just look at the raw numbers, our user base ballooned. But even more interesting is the number of active users that were actually in using it, processing data through. And one that doesn't necessarily jump out as hugely impactful, but truly is the performance. Our legacy systems would start slowing down around close to 100 simultaneous users and fully crash not long after that. And anytime it did that, all ATF users would be having that impact and slowing down, and the amount of work they could process would be dropping along with it, and then they would be sitting there waiting while a call ticket got put in, while the systems were being brought back up online. Now, we hit 1,000 simultaneous users the first day we went live, and we've been pretty regularly hitting over 4,000 simultaneous users now, and keeping up that response. What used to take seconds to minutes was definitely almost instantaneous to seconds. Reports that may have taken 5 minutes, 30 minutes to come back were coming back in seconds to minutes at worst. So the amount of work that those people were able to process on a daily basis was increasing dramatically. And that's shown in just one of our systems called eForms, where those electronic forms are submitted as application requests and they're being processed. Calendar year 2021, before we went live, 14,000 eForms were processed through the system all year long. We're well over 600,000 at this point in 2022, and the year's not over yet. So the ability for the ATF users to process data and do their day jobs has dramatically improved. Now, I'm going to wrap up with just a few final points. I want to revisit that ATF hairball. This is color-coded based on current status. Those in green are now running our production workloads in our AWS cloud infrastructure. The ones in gray are in migration process through projects that are outside of ITEM. The ones in blue, mostly tied to the crime gun tracing mission, are actively being migrated now. And by middle of next year, those will be live in our AWS cloud infrastructure, and we're going to be able to shut down our data center. Now, just a few quick kind of takeaway lessons that I want to pull out of some of those previous comments. One, don't fool yourself into thinking IT people can build business systems. You've got to get the people that actually use them in, helping to guide that. Rebuild your IT governance processes so you can actually make use of all of the modernization technologies and stuff that you bring to bear. Those three in the middle all kind of go together under the banner of automate everything. To help you do that, don't have every project go out there and build their own continuous integration, continuous deployment framework, their own tools and processes. Build one for the enterprise, provide it out there as a service to those development teams, and mandate that your development teams use that and start pulling in and adopting those processes. And set a goal that it may be audacious, but it can serve as a North Star to help guide all of those small incremental decisions along the way. And the one I like is set a goal of 1 production deployment per day, midday while users are on the system. And to be able to do that requires so many pieces in place that it's going to drive how they use those CI/CD environments and how they make decisions on those tools to try to help steer in the direction you want to go. These 2 slides, I'm not going to talk to. They are solely in here as a reference for anybody that wants to download the slides. Just recapping kind of the topic I hit on each of those slides that I talked through. Because for us, these were triage. These were how we got an IT project that was having problems back on track and across kind of a finish line or kind of a beginning line, I think, for continuous improvement. But for us, it was triage. If anyone else is out there with kind of problematic IT processes, take a look at these. They might help you to get some insights into it and to get it on track. And for those of you that are working on undertaking some modernization efforts, take a look at this and see if you can use it as a roadmap or extract some information to help set up how you approach that modernization project. Now, that's where we are today. Where are we going from here? First part's pretty simple. Finish our migration to the cloud and continue improving, continue deploying the features that our users need out of these systems. Start focusing on the actual business process improvements. But now we're in the cloud. We have all of this automation. We're fully containerized, and there's so many tools and capabilities that we can make use of now to continue breaking down our systems into microservices, reducing the duplication, the redundancy between systems and how users have to hop between them, making use of business process automation tools, the kind of robotics tools to automate a lot of the routine processes to let our users focus on the ones that require a little bit more effort, and potentially looking at infrastructure next steps. We're containerized today, looking at serverless as potential ways to reduce the amount of infrastructure we have to maintain. So all of that goes back to how do we keep ourselves from digging ourselves back into that same technical debt hole that we found ourselves in at the start of this. And with that, I don't know how much time we have, but if there are questions and the ability to handle any, I would love to.